Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. We talked about attack and defense in some of the previous lessons, but I am getting back to it in this lesson again, and I promise I will in the future, because I think it's one of the most important subjects in chess to get a better feel and understanding on when an attack succeeds and when it doesn't, or when to be afraid of an attack, or when you don't need to. And I think the only way to kind of improve on that is to see examples like you will in this lesson, as well as to play and try to gain experience. Somehow, more experienced players just sense it better that this is a dangerous attack or this isn't. And I'll try to point out certain characteristics that are common in defense. Let's start with our first example, which is from a real game played in 1997 between Panic and Patterson. They reached this position in the actual game, and it's clear that White is threatening to capture the pawn on h6 as well as the bishop on b7, and Black decided to trade the bishops on g2. And this is a crucial moment when White has two options, or rather three, but basically two ways: either recapture on g2, whether king or knight, or make an intermediate move with bishop to h6 to follow up on the attack on the king side. In this case, White made a mistake not recapturing simply the bishop on g2 and played bishop takes pawn on h6. It seems that this move immediately threatens checkmate, which in fact it indeed does, and that it would force Black to defend against that, and then White would have the time conveniently to recapture on g2. And this is one of those important moments when you need to be aware that when you're being attacked, you don't necessarily have to go on defense immediately. You may be able to look for counterplay instead. And in this case, the move is f5. And here the hint is to always look out for aggressive, forceful, and attacking moves such as this. What's happening here is Black is targeting the pinning piece, which is the queen, and at the same time opens up the 7th rank to protect the crucial g7 square. Of course, you need to be aware of the possibility of White now doing en passant, and I bet White had that in his plan before he captured on h6. Now Black doesn't have much of a choice but to recapture with the queen, attacking the White bishop with the queen, right? So now if king takes bishop on g2, then the Black queen would just capture the White bishop on h6. But what happens if now the White bishop moves to g5, gaining time? Well, this is a critical moment. The Black queen is under attack, and so is still the Black bishop. So if Black just makes a random move with the queen, not only that the Black bishop is hanging on g2, but even the Black rook on d8 is under attack. This is the place where White has miscalculated and didn't realize that the queen does not need to move, but instead Black is able to make an intermediate move by moving the bishop to f3. Now the bishop is on a safe square, attacking the White queen. If the queen moves to h3, of course the bishop on g5 will be just falling. On the other hand, if both sides start capturing pieces, then Black will recapture the bishop on d8, and then capture the pawn on h5. And if you look at the balance at the end of the day, now black has 2 extra bishops for white's rook, which is a material advantage for black. The bottom line is bishop h6 was a mistake. Instead, white should have just recaptured on g2. Let's see another game that's being played by 2 of today's stars, namely the young Magnus Carlsen, who was extra young back in 2005. He was, I believe, 14 years old only at the time, but already a very strong player, against Alexei Shirov, who is an extremely strong and top player for the past 20 or so years. In this position, white is doing okay and decided not to bother with his rook being on attack and captured on g6. And again, it's clear that white has a very nice attack with the 2 bishops pointing towards black's king. Pretty much all the white pieces actually are assisting the attack. And this was a critical moment. Can black capture the rook on e3, or should he simply recapture on g6? Well, in this game, the young Magnus Carlsen bluffed the more experienced Shirov, who didn't dare capturing the rook, which he should have done. Instead, he captured the pawn back on g6. Then white continued with another elegant move, knight f5, and continued the attack this way. Although black shouldn't have lost the game anyway, it still means that after the first move, f takes g6, he should have captured the rook on e3 instead. Again, it looks a bit scary, but if you calculate a bit, you can realize that black in all reality is safe. Pawn captures on f7, check, forces black to capture back. Now if rook takes queen, then pawn takes queen, and black is simply ahead. And after queen e3, it looks dangerous, but in reality it's not as dangerous as it seems. The check is threatening to come to g5 because black has a tricky way to get out of trouble. Namely, moving the queen to c7. Not the only way, but it's the cutest one. And after queen g5, knight g6, bishop g6, it seems that black is in trouble. In reality, they are not, because of the check from g6 and then the queen capturing the bishop, leaving black a full rook ahead. I'd like to mention though also that after fg6, black can safely capture the rook, takes queen e3, in addition to the cute queen c7. Also, rook e5 does the job and leaves black with an advantage. So again, the message is, not all attacks win. Don't be necessarily afraid just because your opponent is attacking or sacrificing. Let's see another game that was played in the German Bundesliga a couple of years ago. This position was reached, and white obviously had a strong kingside attack, but it left white with a serious material disadvantage, having a rook for 3 minor pieces. That's serious. White now is threatening to play queen h5 check and to win the bishop back. If white would be successful with that, white would be okay. The problem is that right now it is black's turn, not white's. So what should black do about this threat? In the game, Black made a mistake. Let me show you why. Black moved his knight to h7 to unpin the bishop. Now, if White would move the queen, for example, to g4, Black could easily retreat the bishop, or, even better, protect it with a pawn. But White can do better. Play queen h5, which is a better place for the queen. And then, after g5, the only move that protects the bishop, simply bring the third major piece to attack and threaten to enter on f7. The game continued with queen e7, rook f7, queen e4, and then rook h to f1, not even bothering to capture the bishop on b7, because that would be a mistake. After rook b7, Black would first check, not capture the rook immediately, which would allow a checkmate in 1. Now the king cannot move up to d3 because of c4 checkmate, and if the king moves down to the first rank, then the queen captures the rook with a check, and the queen then retreats back to e4, protecting the knight, and Black is winning. So therefore, the correct move here was rook h to f1, maintaining the attack on the bishop. And now the threat is, for example, after the bishop moves away, the white rook comes in between the black queen and black knight, threatening with checkmate and pretty much forcing Black to keep perpetual checks with the queen. So, let's go back, and learning from this mistake, now we know this wasn't a good idea, and Black can do better with a simple king g8, moving the king out of the pin, and then after the white rook moves to f1, threatening with queen f7, bishop f6, and all the key squares are guarded by the black knight, and Black's material advantage is obvious, and the game will be won. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. And this position is from one of my own games that I played in a simultaneous exhibition in 2005 against one of the young, talented junior players in the United States, Mark Arnold. In this position, I sacrificed my rook on h7. And I was very happy with my position. I saw the following variation. If he accepts the sacrifice, I will capture on g6. And then after king g7, I will make a discover check. And then announce checkmate in just 3 more moves. 1 and 2 and 3. But here is the trouble. After I captured with my rook on h7, Black has a very good defensive move. Try to think and find that move that saves the game. And that move is d3. A very important move, opening the diagonal of the bishop for counterattack. And now, when I follow up my attack with pawn takes pawn, creating serious threat of checkmate in 1 by capturing with my pawn on f7 next. But my opponent will not give me the time to do that and will constantly keep checking my king. And that's exactly how the game ended, with these constant checks against which I didn't have a hideaway. And the game was a draw. Again, it looked rather scary for my opponent, the attack, but with calmness and determination to find defense, he found the correct move d3. Again, in this case, the motive was looking for counterplay. Also, I didn't have time after d3 to, let's say, simply defend the pawn on f2 with my queen, because then my queen is not there anymore on the g file to support the attack, and black can capture the rook already, or probably even better to simplify the position first by making sure there are no more queens on the board, everything disappears and remains black's material advantage. And now let's see a game that was played in the 2000 Chess Olympiad in Istanbul. It was played between Arencibia from Cuba versus Ye Yingchuan from China. In this position, it's quite obvious that white has a serious attack initiative on the dark squares, especially on that long diagonal. White's idea is to move the queen to f6 and then create a battery with a bishop on b2 and checkmate on g7 on h8. Luckily for black, it is their turn right now. But black made a mistake in this position and did not find the correct defense. Black played queen a4, attacking the bishop, when white succeeded to continue with queen c3, and now the idea is bishop b2, black played rook b8, with the idea that if bishop b2 now, then black would give up the rook for the bishop and get the pawn back, and also the pawn on d5 will be lost soon and the game will be at least a draw, or black will be better. So, after queen a4, queen c3, rook b8, white continued much better, moving the bishop to e7. And now, wherever the rook goes, queen f6 is the follow-up, threatening with capturing the pawn, which pretty much forced black to give up on the rook, and the threat is still there to capture on f7. Came rook f8, and now after queen c7, black's position is hopeless because the two connected passed pawns will simply march down and black's position is miserable. Let's go back to our original position, which was the key moment in the game, where the question is how to defend successfully against white's threat of getting the queen to f6 and then the bishop behind it. The correct move here is moving the queen to c7. Now, first of all, white cannot play queen f6 right away because that would allow queen b6 check, which would immediately trade queens. If white now would play bishop b2 with the idea, after queen takes pawn, to play bishop h8, a tricky move, and then threatening checkmate, then again black can successfully defend after queen c5 and queen f8. Let's go back again. Queen c7. And now the best move for white is queen d4, simply protecting the pawn on c4 with the idea to play bishop b2 next. As well as white now protected the pawn, not only the c4 pawn that was under attack, but also the d5 pawn. So white is about to march up those c and d pawns. And now the correct move again is rook to b8. With the same idea, if bishop b2, black would sacrifice the rook and then capture the pawn on c4. If now white plays bishop c1 to try to appear with the bishop on h6, then black's best move is rook b1. If white advances the pawn to c5, then black would go for counterplay and play rook e8, c6, and play queen a5. Again, if bishop b2, the idea is still to sacrifice the rook and then capture the pawn on d5. And if white plays bishop to c5, then rook e1. So in this case, as you see, black is trying to combine in trying to give up a rook for a bishop and pawn, as well as looking for various ways to get counterplay for his own queen and two rooks. Let's go back for another time and see, after queen c7 and queen d4, rook b8, what happens if white pushes the d-pawn. That, of course, is not very effective because black creates a very nice blockade right away on the light squares. And after c5, again, black would go to activate his rook on the e-file, trying to enter to the second rank on e2. After d7, black could go simply back, of course, to d8, rook d1, and go after the d7 pawn, and always after bishop b2, sacrifice the rook, and then simply capture the pawn. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. This is a really crazy position, right? It's not very likely to happen. Nevertheless, it's a beautiful example of miracles on the chessboard. Black has a clear material advantage here. The only catch is the black king being in an awkward position. White cannot win, but can successfully save the game. I suggest you try to figure out the correct way to a draw. Let me show you a couple of ways that white can go wrong. After knight c1, king a1, white can try to create a stalemate, believe it or not. Even though white has still 4 pieces on the board, white can try to go for stalemate. For example, by giving the bishop up first, the knight next, the rook next, and now the king cannot move anymore. It's in a stalemate position, but there is still the queen in the way. Then the problem is, after check, not king a2, of course, because then all of a sudden white even wins, but rook e1, queen e1, captures, and stalemate. Almost. The problem is that black now recaptures, promoting a knight and checkmate. So this didn't quite work out. Was close though, right? How about trying knight c1, king a1, and queen g7 now? Again, trying to get rid of all our pieces, right? Check, and check, and check. Now if king a2, the knight would just keep going back and forth between b3 and c1. So knight takes, and now the problem is that it's not stalemate, because the rook no longer is on b7 protecting the knight on b3. So the king can capture on b3. Almost, but again, not quite. And here is the beautiful solution. The first move is queen d5. Look at that. Threatening checkmate in 2, namely by knight c1 check, double check, and then queen a2. But of course, the big question is, what happens if the queen will be captured? What happens if black captures it with a pawn? Well, then white gets to actually win the game by checkmating with the bishop. Very nice. Okay, so the real question is, what happens if the queen captures the queen? Well, now we'll be successful in accomplishing the stalemate if we make the moves in the correct order, namely knight check, followed by bishop check, and now, very importantly, not rook a3, because then after the knight check, the rook can capture in addition to the knight, leaving the c1 square open for the white king. But first, knight b3 check. Now, if king a2, white would just repeat moves with knight c1 and b3. And after knight b3, rook a3, black has no choice but capture back, and we achieved a stalemate. Absolutely amazing. Well, thank you for listening. Hope you got some ideas in defense, and next time you're under attack, won't be so scared. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed this beautiful miracle of the week, and be back next week. Bye-bye.